Perception is a powerful thing, but reality is often much darker than it seems. We challenge your view of the world with stories that break through every illusion and reveal the core. Click subscribe now to see what lies behind the curtain.
Worked the overnight shift at St. Benedum the night my husband got the call. I know because I was the one who drove him to the celebration dinner 3 days later. I ironed his shirt. I booked the reservation. I sat across from him and his colleagues and smiled until my cheeks hurt, and nobody, not one person at that table, thought to ask what I did for a living. That was fine. I was used to fine. His name was the one people knew. I was just the woman next to him. Let me back up. I met him when we were both 26. He was in his second year of law school. I was working as a registered nurse at a pediatric unit downtown, pulling double shifts twice a week because the rent on our apartment was not going to pay itself. He was charming and brilliant, and he had this way of explaining things: legal theory, case precedents, the entire architecture of how justice was supposed to work, that made you feel like you were being let in on something important. I fell in love with his mind before I fell in love with him. Maybe that was the mistake. Maybe I loved the idea of what he was going to become more than I ever really saw who he already was. We got married the summer before his 3rd year. My mother cried at the ceremony. His mother gave a toast about how proud she was of her son and what a bright future lay ahead of him. She mentioned me once, in passing, as a wonderful support. I laughed it off. I was 28 and in love, and I thought support was a beautiful thing to be. What I didn't understand then was that support could become the whole structure of a life without you ever agreeing to that. His school debt was substantial. We didn't talk about the number out loud very often, the way you don't say certain words in certain rooms. What we talked about instead was the plan, his plan, the trajectory, the firm he wanted to join, the cases he wanted to take, the reputation he intended to build. I listened to all of it across the kitchen table while I ate cereal, because we couldn't afford anything more elaborate on a Tuesday night after I'd already worked 10 hours. I picked up a second job. Per diem, pediatric home care. It paid better per hour than the hospital, but the hours were unpredictable and the commute was long, and I was exhausted in a way that I started to mistake for just being a person in the world. I didn't question it. He was working hard too, studying for the bar, then clerking, then grinding at a mid-size firm where the hours were brutal and the partners were worse. We were both tired. That was the story I told myself. We were both just tired. Looking back, I can see the shape of it more clearly now. It's like one of those optical illusions, where you can only see the hidden image once someone tells you it's there. The suits I bought him on my credit card because he said he needed to look the part. The bar prep course I covered when his savings ran out. The conferences I funded so he could network with the right people. The groceries, the utilities. The rent when his entry-level salary didn't stretch far enough, and the months right after he passed the bar. All of it mine. All of it given without a ledger because I trusted that we were a unit, that what I put in was going into something shared, some common future that would eventually circle back to me. He never said it wouldn't. He just never said it would either. The first time I noticed something shift was about 4 years in. He'd made associate at a better firm. The money improved. The hours got longer, but the money improved. And he started talking about a separate account for professional expenses. I asked what that meant. He said it was just cleaner, tax-wise. I believed him. I was tired. It was easier to believe him. Then there were the dinners I wasn't invited to. Networking, he said. Just colleagues. He always had a reason that sounded reasonable, and I was always too exhausted from a 12-hour shift to interrogate it. That's the thing nobody tells you about being depleted. It doesn't just affect your body, it erodes the part of you that asks questions. I knew her name before I knew what she was. He mentioned her in passing. A junior associate at the firm, sharp, he said, ambitious. He said it the way people say a thing when they want you to hear it without hearing it. I filed it away. I kept working. I kept ironing his shirts. The call came on a Thursday in October. He'd been shortlisted for a named partnership track at one of the most respected firms in the city. Not the firm he was at, a different one, the one he'd circled in his mind for years. The one with the oak-paneled offices on the 41st floor. He got the offer at 11 in the morning. He texted me a single word: yes. I was between patients. I stood in a hospital corridor and I felt something I can only describe as relief. The particular relief of watching someone you've been carrying finally reach solid ground. I thought, here it is. Here's where the balance tips back. Here is where things change. I went home that night with flowers, grocery store flowers, the only ones I could grab at 8:30 on a Thursday, but still. I set them on the counter and started cooking, and I was happy. I was genuinely, uncomplicated happy. He came home at midnight. He wasn't alone in the way a person is alone when they've just been out late. He came home already having said the things people say after a long celebration, already on the other side of something. He set his bag down, and he looked at me standing in the kitchen, with reheated pasta and wilted grocery store flowers, and he said, with a kindness that was somehow worse than cruelty would have been, "I think we need to talk." I knew. I think I'd known for longer than I had words for, but knowing in the back of your mind and having it said out loud in your own kitchen are two entirely different things. He said the marriage had run its course. He said we'd grown in different directions. He said he would always respect me. He said there was someone else, and then he said her name, and it was her, the junior associate, the one he described as ambitious. And his voice when he said her name had a quality in it that his voice had stopped having when he said mine. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I'd always assumed I would cry. In some distant version of this conversation, I'd never let myself fully imagine. But I didn't. I felt the whole room go very quiet and very clear, the way a space feels after everything extraneous has been removed from it. I asked him one question. I said, "Do you want out?" He said yes. I said, "Then we're done." He looked like he'd expected more. A scene, maybe. Tears or accusations or the kind of argument that lets both people feel like they've fought for the thing even as it ends. I gave him none of it. I went to the bedroom, I closed the door, I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and I let myself feel the full weight of it without an audience. The paperwork arrived 2 weeks later, hand-delivered by a courier to the nursing station at St. Benedum. I was between rounds. My colleague handed me the envelope with a look on her face that I will never forget, the look of someone who is trying to keep their expression completely neutral and failing slightly around the eyes. I signed for it. I tucked it under my arm. I finished my shift. I read it in the parking garage at 7 in the morning with my coat still on. It was thorough. He'd had it prepared in advance. That much was clear from how clean it was, how complete. The financial division was the part that made my vision go white for a moment. The account we called professional expenses had been drawing down from our joint savings for 2 years. The number that remained in that joint account was a fraction of what I'd put in. He'd structured it legally, apparently, and within the letter of what we'd agreed to, apparently, and I sat in that concrete garage and I thought, he knew how to do this. Of course he did. He spent years learning exactly how to do this. I called my mother that afternoon. She said, "Come home." I said, "I can't come home." She said, "Then what do you need?" I said, "I don't know yet." That was honest. I didn't know yet. What I knew was this. I had my nursing license, my salary, my skills, and nothing else. The apartment was in both our names, but his lawyer was already sending polite, methodical emails. I had 30 days to make arrangements. I found a room through a coworker, a woman named she went by Bev. Everyone called her Bev. A 60-something landlord on the 3rd floor of a 4-unit building who had a back unit she rented out. She took one look at me, heard the general outline of my situation in about 90 seconds, and told me she'd do first month at half rate to help me get back on my feet. She said she'd had a similar situation once, a long time ago, and someone had done the same for her. I think about Bev more than she probably realizes. The specific kindness of someone who doesn't know you deciding you are worth a small grace. It changes the shape of a terrible month. I took the room. I put my things in storage. I worked. I won't pretend the next several months were anything other than hard. They were hard in the specific way that financial precarity is hard. Not dramatic, just constant. The low-grade arithmetic of whether the numbers work, run again every few weeks. I didn't eat badly. I didn't fall apart. But I was doing the math all the time, in the back of my mind, the way you do when the margin is thin. What I had, though, was time. Without his schedule to organize around, without the dinners to plan, and the shirts to iron and the listening to do, I had hours in my week I hadn't had in years. I started using them. I enrolled in a nurse practitioner program, part-time, nights, the same hours I'd spent for a decade keeping other people's lives running. It was hard. It was also mine. Every reading assignment, Every exam, every clinical rotation hour, was something I did for no other reason than that I wanted it. I cannot tell you how unfamiliar that felt at first. How foreign it was to do something without calculating what it would cost someone else's trajectory. I heard things about him in bits and pieces, the way you do when you move in overlapping circles in a city that is smaller than it looks. He had moved into a new apartment with her. Upscale building, doorman, the kind of address that signals arrival. His name appeared in a city magazine profile about rising legal talent. There was a photograph of him in a good suit. He had always worn good suits. Standing in front of bookshelves, looking exactly like the person he had intended to become. I read the article once. I set my phone down. I made tea. I thought about my next exam. That was all I gave it. Then I started hearing other things. The woman he'd left me for had her own ambitions, it turned out. She made partner at a smaller firm about 14 months after I moved into Bev's back unit. Good for her, genuinely, but she was not, it seems, interested in playing the role he'd needed someone to play. She didn't want to manage the household around his schedule. She didn't want to subordinate her career to the architecture of his. She didn't rearrange her life to fit inside the frame he'd built. Why would she? She had her own frame. I heard he'd hired a personal assistant for the domestic logistics, the things I'd done for free for 8 years. I heard the apartment was expensive and the overhead was real, and the partnership track at the new firm came with a longer proving period than he'd anticipated. I heard the margins were tighter than the profile made them look. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. He was living the consequences of his own choices at a pace determined entirely by those choices, and none of it had anything to do with me anymore. The moment I understood that, truly understood it, not just intellectually but in my body, in the way I woke up in the morning, was a Tuesday in February 2 years after I signed those papers in the parking garage. I was reviewing a patient chart. My attending said something complimentary about my assessment. I drove home in the dark and I made soup, and I sat at a small table in a room that was entirely mine, and I felt, quietly and without drama, okay. Not healed, exactly. Not over it, in the way people use that phrase, like there's a finish line. Just okay. Oriented toward my own life instead of toward the absence of his. The NP program took 2.5 years. I finished it on a Thursday in June, at a ceremony I attended with my mother and a friend from the hospital who had become the kind of close over those years that only difficulty can make someone. There was no party afterward, just dinner at a restaurant my mother chose and a single glass of wine and the specific pleasure of a thing completed. I started working as a nurse practitioner at a community clinic the following month. The salary was better. The autonomy was significant. I had my own patients now. My own decisions, my own scope of practice. I went home at the end of each day and I was tired in a different way than I'd been tired before. The kind of tired that comes from output rather than depletion. I met someone in the way you meet someone when you have stopped looking, which is to say, when you have stopped needing the looking to mean anything about your own worth. His name is not important to this story except that it is. He was a physical therapist at the clinic. He made me laugh on a day I hadn't expected to laugh. He asked questions about my work and waited for the full answer. He did not, even once, make me feel like a support structure rather than a person. We are not rushing. I am not in a hurry for anything, but I want to tell you about the one time I heard from my ex-husband directly. It was about 3 years after the divorce finalized. I received an email, not to my personal address, to an administrative one at the clinic, which meant he had looked for it. He'd found it through some combination of professional directory and, I can only assume, the kind of determined searching that requires a reason. The email was measured and careful, in the way that his words always were. The architecture of them designed to present a particular impression. He said he'd heard I was doing well. He said he thought about the early years sometimes. He said he wanted to talk, if I was ever open to it. I read it twice. I closed my laptop. I never replied. Not out of anger. The anger had burned down a long time ago, the way fires do when they run out of fuel. Not even out of strategy, some calculated silence designed to send a message. I didn't reply because there was nothing in that email that required a response from me. He hadn't asked a question I owed an answer to. He had no claim on my time or my attention or my grace, and I felt no obligation to give any of those things to him anymore. That was the thing I hadn't understood when I was 28, that your time is yours. That your attention is yours. That your attention is yours. that choosing who gets access to both of those things is one of the few real powers you have in this life, and giving it away without examination is the most expensive thing you can do. Far more expensive than any suit, any account, any 8 years of doubled shifts. I blocked the address after the 3rd day of not replying, not to punish him but because I found it took up a small amount of mental real estate every time I saw it in my inbox. And mental real estate is finite, and I preferred to use mine differently. My mother, when I told her about it, laughed. A short, satisfied laugh, the kind she reserves for moments when she feels that justice, not the dramatic kind, not the kind with speeches and reversals, but the quiet, structural kind, has done its work correctly. She said, "You know what the best part is?" I said, "Tell me." She said, "You didn't even have to do anything, you just became yourself." That is the most accurate description I have ever heard of what the last several years have felt like. I didn't fight. I didn't plot. I didn't wait for a particular outcome to validate the choice I'd made in that parking garage at 7 in the morning with my coat still on. I just gradually, imperfectly, on a schedule that had no audience, became myself. My clinic hours are good now. The work is meaningful. I have a small apartment that I have furnished slowly, one deliberate piece at a time, without consulting anyone's taste but my own. There is a chair by the window where I sit on Sunday mornings with coffee and a book, and nothing in particular to accomplish. I have friends who know my full name and my history and love me because of it rather than despite it. I am not living a glamorous life. I am not living a dramatic one. What I am living is a life in which I am the subject rather than the setting, and after so many years of being the latter, I cannot tell you how extraordinary the ordinary feels. He made partner, eventually. I heard from a mutual acquaintance a few months ago. Named partner even, his name on the door, which had always been the image at the center of his plans. I thought about that for a moment. His name on a door, and I felt genuinely nothing. Not satisfaction. Not bitterness, not even the residue of old grief. Just nothing. Clean and total. He got exactly what he wanted. So did I. The difference is that what I wanted turned out to be myself. I've spent a lot of time thinking about cause and effect since everything happened, not in a dramatic way, not lying awake running the math, but in the quiet, unavoidable way that clarity arrives after the noise stops. He made choices, specific, deliberate ones. He chose to take what I offered without ever asking whether the offering was sustainable. He chose the separate account, the long explanations that weren't quite explanations, the careful legal architecture that protected him when he was ready to leave. He chose to hand me that envelope at a nursing station via courier on a Tuesday morning. Each of those choices had a shape to it, and shapes have consequences, and the consequences arrived on a schedule entirely his own making. Not mine, not anyone else's. That's the part I had to sit with. I couldn't have engineered what happened to him. I didn't need to. He built the structure himself, and the structure had the weaknesses built into it from the start. When the woman he left me for turned out to be her own person with her own ambitions and no interest in being someone's infrastructure, that wasn't my doing. That was just reality meeting expectation, the way it always does eventually. What I know now that I didn't know at 28 is this: integrity isn't a performance. It's not something you do so that you'll be rewarded later, so that the universe settles the account in your favor. I worked those double shifts because patients needed care and I was good at my work and it was mine to do. I went back to school because I wanted to grow, not to prove anything to anyone who wasn't paying attention. I didn't forgive him as a strategy. I just ran out of energy for the anger and redirected it somewhere useful. That's what I mean when I think about intelligence. Not the kind measured on tests, but the kind that learns from experience and adjusts. I adjusted slowly, imperfectly. I made the mistake of staying in a situation longer than was wise because I kept updating the wrong variable. I kept thinking the problem was solvable if I just worked harder, gave more, asked less. It took a courier envelope in a parking garage at 7 in the morning to show me that some problems are not yours to solve. Bev, my landlord for that first difficult year, never asked me to explain myself or earn her kindness. She just gave it, cleanly, because she understood what it cost nothing to give and what it meant to receive. I have tried to carry that forward, the willingness to extend a small grace without requiring it to be justified. I think that impulse, that basic ethical reflex toward other people's difficulty, matters more in a life than most of what we optimize for. And the resilience. I want to say something honest about that, not the motivational version. Resilience is not the absence of falling apart. I fell apart. Quietly, privately, in a rented room with thin walls. It looked like eating cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row and staring at a wall for longer than I meant to. It looked like crying in a hospital bathroom between patients and then washing my face and walking back out. That's all resilience actually is. You fall apart and then you wash your face and you walk back out. There is no more heroic version available. What I ended up with, the work I find meaningful, the small apartment I've furnished exactly how I want it, the person beside me who asks questions and waits for answers, none of it came from a plan. It came from the accumulation of days in which I chose again and again to orient toward my own life instead of toward the wreckage of someone else's choices. That's the whole of it. That's everything I know.